Hello. The months and years have gone by, as they always have, I suppose. But here we are again with Spirit Island. We're back partly just because I've been playing some Spirit Island on paper lately, and it's fun, and I realized I want to do more of this. Also, because since the last time I did a video, quite some time ago, they have come out with the first expansion, Branch and Claw, for the Steam client, which has given us more of everything, including 2 new spirits, one of which is Sharp Fangs behind the leaves here, but also adds the event system, which is a really fun element, I think, that we've been enjoying in the tabletop version for a long time. So that's really cool. We're still either 1 or 1.5 expansions behind on the digital client, depending on how you count the Feather and Flame expansion, which is just some stuff that you could get through their site compiled. Some of the stuff from it is in here, which is to say Wildfire and Serpent, but there are a couple other spirits and maybe an Invader or something that aren't on here yet. Anyway, the big one that isn't on here is Jagged Earth, which I'm really hoping they'll get to at some point because it just has a million spirits, some of which are incredibly weird and cool. But of course, having a million spirits, some of which are incredibly weird, probably makes it take a long time to program. They're also currently working on online multiplayer, which is going to be really exciting. You can play multiplayer now through the Steam sort of general overlay for playing with friends, but it's kind of weird. Having actual online multiplayer will be cool. It's an open beta, but I haven't messed with it yet. I'll probably try to do a video on that at some point once it comes out of beta or something, if I can get people to play with me. We'll see. Anyway, today I might do a game, depending on how long this takes, but I definitely want to go over the new stuff from the expansion at least a little bit. We'll start with Sharp Fangs here by the highly scientific method of, this is the one that I ran into when I was scrolling through first. Sharp Fangs behind the leaves is not my very favorite spirit, unfortunately, although it's cool. I like the idea of just like weird giant nonsense beasts that mess with the invaders and stuff like that. My opinion of it is that it has a sort of an unfortunate issue of being really similar to Thunderspeaker, who's one of my very favorite spirits ever, as I've said before, but feels a lot more awkward to use, and the reason for that is that Sharp Fangs behind the leaves interacts with beast tokens, which are this little symbol here. That's what they look like on the board too. It's a little red claw. Beast tokens are one of 2 new token types added by the expansion. They're interesting because on their own they have no game function at all. They're just a marker. It means that apparently there are a bunch of beasts in that land. If Sharp Fangs behind the leaves is not involved with the game, the primary interaction you get with beast tokens is through the event system, which I'll talk about later, but in short sort of means that they periodically do random, vaguely useful things, but don't really do a whole lot else. Sharp Fangs behind the leaves does a whole lot with these beast tokens. You can see they have this ranging hunt power, which is really, really similar to Thunderspeaker's I can't remember which one it's called that lets Thunderspeaker do something like this, but it's similar. You first gather beasts, and then you push beasts, and so the target land is often, the actual land you target is often just going to be a waypoint for the beasts, rather than where they end up. Now, the advantage of this power over Thunderspeakers, one advantage is that it is always fast, whereas for Thunderspeakers you have to have 4 air to unlock being fast. This is obviously important. The other big advantage, obviously, is that once you get to a relatively difficult threshold, just because you need 3, I mean, I guess I shouldn't even necessarily say it's difficult because you can get some of them off of the track. But once you get to this 3 beast 2 plant threshold, the target land isn't exactly just a way station anymore because the beasts there are going to do some damage before they move on. So the ideal version of this is actually quite reasonable. You know, the sort of ideal is, okay, I'm going to pick somewhere with a moderate number of invaders in it. I'm going to gather some beasts in there. I'm going to kill all the invaders in there. Then I'm going to push the beasts on so that I'm set up to do that somewhere else next turn. Pretty strong. It has a couple of issues. One big issue is it can't target lands with Blight. This is always going to be annoying. It is basically prohibitive in terms of running Sharp Fangs behind the leaves with any of the spirits that enjoy getting Blight all over the place. Like, if you try to run Fangs plus Wildfires, it becomes incredibly difficult to move the beasts around because your friends, everywhere where your friend's presence is after like turn 2 or 3, has Blight on it most of the time, which means you can't move beasts through that land effectively. The other problem with it is that there just aren't very many beasts that start on the board. The rules for Setup and Branch and Claw give a free beast in one land on each board. The exact details don't really matter. The computer handles it. But basically, you can count on one beast per board for the setup rules, no matter who's on the board. When you are playing Sharp Fangs behind the leaves, you get an extra beast in the highest numbered jungle on your starting board with your presence. You also get to have pretty spread out presence, which is cool, because you get to put one presence in a land of your choice with beasts anywhere on the island, which is neat. Just a little side note. But yeah, you can also replace your presence with beast tokens, which just, like, Ultra removes the presence, so you can't synergize it with Blazing Resurgence, which is sort of too bad. But you can sort of gradually get a bunch of beasts onto the island, but it comes with the real downside that it makes it hard for your presence to be on the island. Like Thunder Speaker, you can move your presence with the beasts, so I think the sort of broad idea is that you're going to sort of relatively quickly develop 2 to 3, or like 1 per, I'm thinking of a 2-player game, but like around 1 per board, probably, packs of roving beasts that each have 1 presence with them and move around the board spreading chaos. You don't have anything in your base deck that cares about places of power or anything like that. And obviously having a fast speed power that can move your presence means that you get to be pretty flexible with your targeting by just moving the beast pack around. Now, of course, it can be awkward because the really powerful plays usually involve addressing more than one land at once, and if you're not triggering this yet, or whatever, or if they're far apart, you can have a problem where the land you want your beast pack to deal with isn't very close to the land you want your played power card to deal with, and you have targeting issues if you've been too aggressively turning your presence into beasts. On the other hand, the only way to make this power very good is to add beasts to the board, and this is one of the best ways to do it. So that's one of the tensions you face. So that's sort of the overall gameplay of how Sharp Fangs Behind the Leaves works. Very broad strokes. You want to create a couple of big packs of beasts that roam around killing everyone. Fair enough. Now, the reason I say that this often feels like worse Thunder Speaker to me is that, as we've seen in some of the Thunder Speaker games, the way you want to play as Thunder Speaker is you want to create a couple of big armies of Dahan that march around the board killing everything. Well, I gotta say, on just a basic level, obviously there are differences and nuance between how things work, and that's important, but on a very basic strategic level, that's just a better plan, because the Dahan do a lot on their own, and there are a lot of them that start on the board, right? You've got 8 Dahan, 6 Dahan. I think it's 2 lands with 2 and 2 lands with 1. Anyway, you've got 6 plus Dahan starting per board, whereas you have 2 beasts on one board and 1 beast on each other board. That's a big gap to overcome. Like, you just have a lot more Dahan to work with as Thunderspeaker than you have beasts to work with as Sharp Fangs. On top of that, having Dahan in a land is really valuable. So there are cases where just moving Dahan around is on its own highly valuable. There are not really a lot of cases where just moving beasts around, if you don't have anything else you're doing with it, does anything. It lets you move your presence, fine, but, so does Thunderspeaker moving Dahan. But, just having beasts in a land, there's some minor upside to it because they interact with a fair number of events in ways that are vaguely useful. But, we're not talking about 2 damage per surviving Dahan during Ravages here, which is a really powerful ability. Now, sure, there's also the fact that it's much harder for the beasts to go away. That only happens due to a couple of events, whereas the invaders can kill the Dahan. It's a complicated game. I'm not saying it's a perfect analogy, but one of my frustrations with trying to play this spirit has generally been that it feels like you are building up combos other than once you can trigger this, where at least you're doing something as part of the movement, this middle bit here. What instead you're doing is setting up to combo with Frenzied Assault, setting up to combo with some of the cards from your hand. And so you're spending a lot of your turn arranging for something to happen, which makes it difficult to cover a lot of lands, which is something you need to do, especially on higher invader levels, and so on and so forth. Anyway, not to belabor the point too long, the growth tracks on Sharp Fangs Behind the Leaves are interesting because it's a pick 2 situation. You have to pay 1 energy to reclaim your cards, which sucks. Sorry. I say it sucks just because it's sort of a weird newbie trap. Like, if you spend down all of your energy, which is easier to do with events coming up too, you can get trapped with no cards to play, but you're also unable to reclaim. I guess that's not technically true. You can always pick one of these as your first one and then use it to pay for this. Yeah, okay, I'd forgotten about that. You can do them in any order you want. So you can get locked into doing one of these. On the other hand, the upside, and this is a genuine upside, this is one of the few spirits in the game that can also grow on the turn it reclaims. So you don't have the most common pattern, which is to say you spend a bunch of turns growing, but then you have to have a reclaim turn where you don't grow, which is awkward both because you don't get to get more powerful, but even more importantly because you don't get to improve your targeting solutions. That said, there's a big downside to the growth option. There is only 1 growth option on this board. It's got great range, which is great, but it's incredibly restrictive. You can only add your presence to a jungle or to a land with beasts. What this means is that outside the jungle spaces, it's really hard to colonize into lands that you can't move your beasts into with this power, which plays into the thing where you have to be really careful about letting Blight get added to the island or playing Sharp Fangs with a spirit that adds Blight. Because if you end up with a sort of a wall of Blight across the island, you can end up with areas of the island that are close to as inaccessible to you as they are to, say, Ocean or someone who's strictly restricted in where they can place their presence. Something to be aware of. It is nice that you can go a long way into jungles, so if you need to start a new beast pack somewhere, there's probably a jungle relatively close by, but it does feel slow. You need to have some foresight about it, which can be hard at the higher levels where things can change a lot in the single invader phase. Okay, and then you've got power card energy, which is a perfectly reasonable thing to tack onto your growth option. Since this is a pick 2, unless you end up having to use a payment option to get this, or like you really need a burst of energy or something, my thought is that you want to be planning to grow every single turn of the game. You do run hot on energy, so you have to budget somewhat for this, and it might be that you end up wanting to use this pretty regularly. But one way or another, I look at the other 3 options as things you can tack onto this growth option, because I just think, especially since you can turn your presence into beasts, and you have your top tracks are pretty reasonable. Like, yeah, I think you really, really want, if at all possible, to be picking this every turn. So realistically, you're looking at presence plus reclaim and power card at a cost of 1, which is fine. Presence plus power card and energy, fine. Presence plus 3 energy, fine. All of those are good but not great growth options. I would say. Pretty standard. Again, aside from the fact that you want to have some foresight with your energy management, you don't get a lot of energy off your track. It takes a long time to get to 2. You do get elements, which is nice. The animal element especially is nice because this is, by and large, a pretty good power, but you need a lot of beasts to get to it. Probably not reasonable to get to this with card plays alone. In general, a lot of the best cards out of the power deck don't have beast symbols too, although that is helped somewhat by the expansion. So I think if you're aiming for this power, or even aiming to maximize this power, you're probably going to be well served by going up the energy track rather than the card play track initially. Though the card play track is also good, and it's nice that if you get, especially if you cap it out, you probably never have to use this ability, which is nice because you obviously always rather use this one if you can. Yeah, I mean, I'm getting a bit sidetracked onto the tracks when talking about the growth options, but basically, you want to be careful picking between these 2. It's tempting to get power cards, and I think you should do it early because, as we're about to see, your starting cards aren't very good. But there is a downside that you have to be pretty picky with your minor powers because you really, really want beast symbols, and ideally you want beast and plant symbols on the cards because you want to trigger this every single turn if you possibly can. And you also, as you're getting into this, you may have to pick this up just because even if you're picking this growth option, you're still only getting 2 energy per turn for a long time, even if you go up this track. So, yeah. You feel really tight on resources early on. Now, one reason is that you have a real power that comes off of your bar. Like, this is a real early game power, especially if you're getting the 2-3, which you can get this on turn 1 if you just unlock this animal and you play the right cards out of your hand, right? You have to play exactly these 2 cards, which is a bummer. But if you want to get this on turn 1, or more realistically, if you want to get this on turn 2 to stop a Ravage or something like that, you can set up for it by leaving these 2 for turn 2, although the fact that neither of these are your fasts makes that a bit of a bummer. These sort of interact weirdly. Anyway, the point is, I think this is another one where I think both of the tracks are pretty viable. You can go up the energy track to get the animal and the plant. That is probably better than getting the 3rd card play just in terms of triggering this all the time because, as we can see, plant is not widely available even on the starting cards, let alone the problems of trying to draw plant beast specifically off of your starter cards. If you unlock both of these, then by playing 1 plant beast card and then a beast card, which is obviously much easier since all your starter cards have beasts, then you will always get the best version of this, which is great. It's sort of too bad that you only get to move 2 beasts at once with this. It doesn't scale as much as Thunder Speaker's power, but being able to get it at max level, even so, you can always do 2 damage in the land if you set up for it and have 2 beasts there. You can maybe get a little bit more if you convert your presence or whatever. Yeah. 2 damage is about all you expect with this, which is too bad, but at least it'll clear out a house or something. you really want to try to have a strong early game with beasts, because once things start getting serious, your starting deck does not have a lot of ways to deal, unlike someone like Thunderspeaker, where a lot of your starting stuff scales really well as you start to get more Dahan, particularly Manifest, and you burn X per Y Dahan or whatever, right? This never scales up in terms of how many beasts it involves, except in terms of the damage. So the more damage you want this to do, the more outside help you need to herd those beasts around to where you need them. And then this one scales the damage up, but it doesn't actually scale the damage based on the number of beasts involved again. It's very difficult to trigger, and it never does more than 3 damage, and it costs you a beast. So one of the reasons that I find this an awkward spirit is I mostly play at higher difficulties where it's much harder to keep things under control early on. My guess is if you played this guy at difficulty 0, it would be very impressive, because you could quite easily arrange to clear off your whole board early on and basically keep it clear throughout the entire game. Maybe until level 3 powers showed up, invader cards showed up, although even then, you could probably clean the interior well enough that you'd only be getting the coastal hits. This feels very much like a spirit about building early game momentum and then consolidating it, but that's much harder to do against some of the higher level invader cards, which is worth being aware of. Anyway, so my suggestion would be start with the energy track in most circumstances until you've unlocked animal and plant. My inclination would be to build purely for minor powers, gaining power cards frequently to avoid having to use this early or ever, and then grow into the reclaims to try to never have to do this again, and to build up towards things like this with more minor powers. It does get complicated because you will want a major eventually, because none of your innate powers have the kind of really brutal high element cost abilities that make me want to build someone entirely with minors. Some of the spirits that have just really, really good innate powers, you can go completely minor based builds and just build up to the top levels of them, and that's as good as playing a major. That's not true for Sharp Fangs. If you want to do major damage, you're going to need to get a major power at some point. Unfortunately, since you can only grow once per turn, and you cap out at 4 energy on the presence track, I don't think it's right to just go pure energy and get majors, but it's possible that if you lean heavily on the +3 energy gain, that's a sensible thing to do. I've never tried it. Maybe when I do the test game with this spirit, I'll try it out and see if it works better than what I usually do. Honestly, I could see it if you get beast or beast plant-based majors. You just write off this power, because it's not all that good, and you sort of awkward to have to remove the beasts. You lean on this off of your core thing, and then you hope to do major delivery with these things. I suspect that would work better if you could reasonably get up to like the 3rd energy plus the reclaim one. But to me, that's enough growth options that to me that looks to be realistic only if you're playing with Spread of Rampant Green, or if you get lucky off your first major being one that lets you grow. I don't know. We'll see. Anyway, let's talk quickly about these. I say, having just talked for like 20 minutes about everything else. Whatever. Anyway. Prey on the Builders. Gather a beast. If target land has beasts and invaders, do not build there this turn. This is a good card. It is really unfortunate that it's range 0. This feels to me a lot like a equivalent of Sudden Ambush in Thunderspeaker, which is the one where you gather a Dahan and then Dahan kill 1 explorer per Dahan. Both of them are 1-cost things that move one of the things you care about around and prevent a build one way or another. This one is basically worse in every way, unfortunately. But the range 0 I really want to highlight as a problem with this one, because what I really want to do with this one is use it to start moving my beast pack so that I can make up for some of the downside of this one only gathering 1 beast, and it doesn't do that. It's really too bad, and I always want it to. Sudden Ambush maybe costs 2. But in any case, no, I think it costs 1. Wow, you can tell it's been a long time since I've played a lot of Spirit Island because I've forgotten what some of my favorite cards do. Anyway, this one, just be aware of the range when you're using this one. That said, any card that's going to prevent a build for 1 energy is going to be good. You also can team it up with this one to move the beast. Since this is fast, you can move the beast into the land where you want to prevent the build first and then do it, assuming the land isn't blighted. It doesn't let you get into blighted lands, which sucks, and it doesn't let you Vanguard for this, which is also too bad. So just be aware of those things. It's also the only Fire Moon, or even Fire or Moon card in your starting deck, which means if you want to trigger this ability, you're stuck playing this card or playing a Fire Moon deck out of the Power deck, which I can never recommend because almost all the minor powers with Fire and Moon are terrible. The expansion probably helps that just because all of the ones in the base game were so bad, but it's still, even with all the expansions currently in tabletop, whenever I see a Fire Moon power, I'm sad about it. So, yeah. Anyway, be aware that if you want to use this ability, you probably have to play this for most of the game. So, Too Near the Jungle, free, slow, eats an explorer within range 1 of a jungle, where you have presence. Pretty good. It makes a Furor for your bonus. I always enjoy killing an explorer for 0. This does have the downside that it kills exactly 1 explorer and never more than 1 explorer, which hilariously means that it is bad against the new adversary from this expansion, France, who gets a bunch of double explorers. I'm pretty sure that's France. Anyway, I'll mention that again when we talk to France. But for various reasons, I originally, when I was thinking about coming back and doing a couple more videos about the expansion, I thought, oh, it'll be fun to bring the two... I'll face France with the 2 spirits from this expansion, but both of them have real problems against France, such that I was having trouble winning at any reasonable difficulty with just the 2 of them against France, so that was kind of funny. And Too Near the Jungle is a contributor to that. It's a great card. It's very important. It's a little awkward because obviously you have to commit to playing it before you know where they're exploring, so there's some chance that you can't target it, but assuming that you have the sort of middlemost jungle on each board with a beast, with a presence in it, which is pretty easy to arrange since your presence can always add to jungles with your grow option. You can always add to jungles even if there aren't beasts there. If you've got presence in the central jungle on 1 or both boards, it's very difficult for them to explore such that this won't hit something. Now, of course, that assumes everything around the jungle is empty and they don't hit the one that causes them to go into somewhere where there's already a village, so destroying the explorer is not great. It's certainly awkward. This would obviously be a lot better if it was fast, like most powers in the game. But it's still a good power. It's still an important tool. You still want to be aware that it is much less useful against certain invader cards or on the thematic board because both of those create situations where there are multiple explorers in the same land earlier on in the game. And so this destroy 1 explorer goes from being great, the whole problem caused by the explorer into that land is gone, to, wow, that really didn't do very much. Teeth Gleam from Darkness. Side note, this is the greatest picture ever. Just like, can you imagine you're like, gonna build my homestead on this island, and then you're like getting ready to put the kids to bed and you look out and you just see this? Nah, I don't love that. 1 of Fear seems a little low. Anyway, this is another one that can't target a blighted land. Worth remembering. Another range 1 from Jungle. These 2 cards alone add to some awkwardness because it means that while you'd really like to send your presence roving around with packs of beasts, you'd also sort of like to keep a presence in each of the jungles just so that you can continue to play these cards no matter where the beasts happen to wander around. Makes it harder to just really aggressively call forth predators and still be able to target later on. Less of a big deal, again, because they're both slow powers and you're going to be growing into potentially into jungle on almost every single turn of the game, so you can generally set them up when you need to, but it's worth being aware of it. when you're thinking about whether you're going to call forth predators. So this is a slow power. It adds a fear and a beast. It doesn't do anything, and it's slow. Or if the land has both beasts and invaders, you add 3 fear. This is a card that exists to generate 3 out of the 4 elements you care about, and that's about the end of the story on it, I'm afraid. Yeah, this card is certainly present in your deck. It sucks that it costs an energy and does nothing. I mean, does nothing is a strong word, but they love making cards like this. There's another beast-based spirit in the new tabletop expansion, which I like a little bit more. Well, no, significantly more than Sharp Fangs, but it has a similar one like this. They love making these cards that are slow and don't do anything substantive to affect the board other than create your tokens, and I find it's incredibly difficult to weave them in. It's a little easier on Sharp Fangs than on some, just because you start with 2 card plays, and so you don't have to grow into it, and you can always play this on turn 1 with this if you want to trigger this, which is real. You know, this is a bad card, but if you add on top of it, and also I get Ranging Hunt's damage power, then suddenly it's not nearly as bad a card. You can't have the beast to the place where you're going to Ranging Hunt and get the power, because Ranging Hunt's fast and this is slow, so that's annoying, but, you know, whatever. In general, in the early game, making boatloads of fear is just not worth it. In the late game, where you might have some benefit from making the boatloads of fear, you're certainly going to have gotten some cards that do better than this. You know, I guess in some situation, you play it on a late turn in the game for this, because you notice that 3 fear will push you over into the next fear card, so heck, why not, or whatever. And you didn't replace it because you were going the all-minor power build, so you didn't replace anything, whatever. There's a reason to play this card. That reason is triggering this. That's probably the only reason. If you get one of those rare early victory lap turns where, say, you're paired with another really good early game spirit, you've got everything under control, you've got a turn where you can just where you're just sort of at loose ends for triage, you can play this. It'll gradually, it'll give you a fear and improve your future prospects a little better. This is also the only way out of the base deck to really get around a Wall of Blight. No, because you can't target a blighted land. Just kidding. You can't get around a Wall of Blight. You can, if you're lucky, in the specific case where the jungle that you're in is the land that's blighted that's getting in your way, you can target out of a blighted jungle into a non-blighted land to get a beast over a wall, but that's pretty fiddly. But you can do that. Maybe it'll come up. I don't know. Finally, we have Terrifying Chase. Another classic range 0, so you have to put it somewhere where you already have your stuff. Another slow, but this one is quite powerful. Pushing 2 explorers, villages, Dahan, any combo. That's pretty good. You push another 2 per beast in the land. Since you have to target a land at range 0, there are probably some beasts there. That's just sort of how you work. This is going to, in most cases, this is going to push out all of the Dahan and certainly all of the villages and explorers in the area, maybe all of the Dahan too, pretty likely all of the Dahan too. That means, in practical terms, it's going to be great if you play it somewhere where there are only villages, explorers, and Dahan, and kind of awkward if you play it anywhere with a city, because you can't push the city, but you're required to push as many of these as possible, so there's a risk that you have to push all the Dahan that would burn the remaining city out, which is sort of too bad. Though, if you sequence it so that you do this before or after Ranging Hunt to mess with the number of beasts in the land, that can fix it, assuming you can keep a presence behind. Obviously, if you want to move some of the beasts out, you can't move your only presence there with it, or you won't be able to target it anymore. This is definitely one I can see myself screwing up a lot and costing myself targeting on or whatever. But it is a very powerful card. This is competitive with the best push cards in River Surges, like Sunlight, or in Sunlight. The River Spirit. This is compatible with the best push cards in the River Spirit. Those cards are fantastic. It's a good card. nice role player. They're clearly aware it's a good card because it has no good elements for you. It's just got a random sun that you don't care about. But it's a good card. You'll get good early game use out of it. Good for preventing ravages, etc., etc. Overall, I think these cards aren't very good. There's not really a standout, except maybe Terrifying Chase. I guess Terrifying Chase is a standout. It also makes 2 fear on top of it, which is sort of nice. You get sort of a backdoor fear option. You get some cards that make some chip fear, which isn't nothing. Yeah, I'd say Terrifying Chase is the best card out of the starter deck. I'd say it's not... I'd say it's still worse than 2 or maybe 3 of Thunderspeaker's starting cards. It's certainly worse than Words of Warning, probably worse than Manifest, probably worse than Sudden Ambush. So, that sort of gives you an idea of the awkwardness here. But I've seen Spirits with worse starting cards for sure. Teeth Gleam from Darkness is very bad. These 2 are both fine, if a little bit awkward. It is true that 3 out of the 4 starting cards can reasonably prevent a build. Or, well, reasonably deal with a build. These 2 can prevent it. This one removes it. That's important when, again, what you're talking about with most Sharp Fangs games is you really want to get your board on lockdown early because you have so much trouble dealing with the big stuff. But yeah, overall, I would not put this Spirit high on my tier lists, unfortunately, because the idea is cool. I love the idea of, just turning all the beasts in the world against the excuse me, against the invaders, but it really feels to me like this is sort of a first draft of the Beast Spirit in the second game, and that when they were designing this, when they thought that just having a bunch of beast tokens on the board would end up being more reliably good than it is, which is totally understandable. I've done my fair share of design. I'm not saying they suck or anything. Spirit Island's a great design, but I think this Spirit is a little bit weak. Again, it would probably be very fun to play on early levels if you were a new person who really enjoys the flavor of it, because if you do get your island on your side on lockdown, you're going to keep it in a way that some spirits can struggle with, even against the higher level cards, because the way you just sort of do incidental damage as you move your beasts around means that you're going to clear out those random houses and explorers that aren't ravaging pretty quickly, which can be a problem for a lot of other spirits. So that's the advantage. You can non-interactively clear lightly settled spaces, which is legitimately good. That's a powerful thing to be able to do, and you can do it fast, so it is not a completely non-credible way to prevent a ravage too. That said, this is probably the worst spirit in the game at dealing with any invader space that has actually gotten to the point where it is a credible threat during a ravage, right? There's just nothing you can do about that. You're just getting ravaged. Unless you can clear it out with this. But again, I don't consider that a credible threat. It's also very difficult to get rid of the initial city on your starting board. The only way to do it out of your base deck is with this. Now, of course, you also gain new powers very quickly. You get a defense card or 2 early, and that fundamentally changes. But it's worth being aware that one of the best things you can do in Spirit Island is make the Ravage Step your friend, and as Sharp Fangs Behind the Leaves, it is very difficult to make the Ravage Step your friend. Just to be aware of it. Okay, enough about the Cat Spirit. Let's click on until... Whoops. Nope. I guess I must have just missed it. Where are we? Keeper of the Forbidden Wilds. Here we go. This is the other new spirit with the expansion. This is sweet art. I like the look of this fellow. So, take a look at the Keeper. Keeper of the Forbidden Wilds interacts with the other token type from the expansion. Actually, there are 3 token types in the expansion, now that I think of it. One of the other token types, which is 4 token types? Wow. I've gotten rusty. Anyway, there are a bunch of new tokens that are introduced in the expansion. There are, in fact, 4. I said 2. I was, merely off by 50%. Anyway, the other token that a spirit interacts with is wilds. Wilds, unlike beasts, none start on the board unless something tells them to. Wilds, unlike beasts, do have a game effect. The wilds token basically prevents the next explore that would happen in a land, and then it goes away. So they try to explore into a land that has that token. No explorers are placed, no matter how many would be placed, so at least that interacts better with France's double explore. But then the wilds token goes away. Simple. So, Keeper of the Forbidden Wilds, the idea is that there are places in the island that are forbidden to humans, and there's a spirit of sanctity that says, don't trespass even the Dahan, these are not places for you. That's this spirit, or at least this is one of those spirits. It's never clear to me whether there's supposed to be only one Keeper of the Forbidden Wilds on the island, or whether there are several, but, the one you're playing is the one that's actually willing to fight the invaders, whereas the other one's just doing what it always did. Unclear. Anyway, this comrade basically says the wilds are not for people, stay out. And the way that they describe the playstyle is similar. It's a slowly growing wall, can be difficult to expand, but the invaders will have a difficult time penetrating where the keeper plants itself. You slowly grow out. I like the idea of that sort of creeping untouched land. I'm not sure it really comes out in play, but we'll get to that. So you start with only one presence on the board, but you got a wilds there, so it's hard for them to invade into it, so that's nice. It can get sort of awkward when you're playing a higher level invader that starts with something there, because the idea is that it's hard for them to get into the area you start. It's kind of weird if they were already there, but luckily it's pretty easy for you to clear people out of there, so it's fine. I said that I'm not sure this spirit's theme really comes off in play, and I'll stick to that, but I will say overall Keeper of the Forbidden Wilds is a much stronger spirit than Sharp Fangs is. And that's almost entirely due to the growth and presence tracks. Keeper of Forbidden Wilds has very powerful energy track. You get up to 9 energy, which is a boatload. You get up to 4 quite quickly. You get some incidental elements off of it, which is never nice. There's sun and plant, both of which are pretty good elements to have. And you just quickly get a whole lot of energy. You can get 2 card plays with 1 growth. It does cost you a growth, which is always a bummer, but you can get it with just 1 growth. Your card play track after that point is good. You get a card play off of every single growth on the card play track, other than this first one here. There's a little bit of a hump, but once you get up in here, it's very good. You'll probably never get to here, but if you want to play 3 cards, you can do it. If you want to play 4 cards, it's not much harder. If you really want the reclaim one, I guess you get to 5. But you're only really going to do this, I think, if you're finishing the track most of the time. Maybe you'll get up to here and then go to it because 7 energy is enough. But the reason you'd want this one is because you're going to play the same major power every turn and you don't want to have to bother to reclaim to do it. But anyway, those growth tracks are both good. This one especially, this energy growth track is a real standout. And you get the pick 2 growth options that both of the expansion spirits have, and they're pretty good. One big problem is it's actually really difficult to spread out from your starting place, because you can only, with this growth option, you can only add presence to wilds, lands with wilds, and again, none start on the board, so you've got to manually add those wilds to be able to place the presence there. And it's worse than it sounds, because the way the timing works, there's no way to add a wild and then immediately add a presence there, which means some of the time you add a, like, if you're like, this is exciting, I'll add a wilds at fast with like this, and then I'll grow into there. Well, no, maybe you won't, because they might try to explore into the land where you added the wilds in order to, before you can grow into there. So really, in terms of setting up for your own growth off of just the stuff you start with, you have to do it with this. And this only has range 1. So it looks like you can grow at range 3, but as they talk about with the slowly expanding wall, it's difficult to arrange just because you need outside help from other spirits or from cards to get your presence into lands at more than range 1, and even though this is range 3, it's difficult for you to set up to target anywhere that far away. Now, the event deck will sometimes spit out wilds tokens that you can take advantage of, assuming that they don't get immediately explored into and negated. Obviously, things can change out of the basic deck, etc. But one thing to be aware with Keeper of Forbidden Wilds, if you're just looking at it independently of who it's teaming up with or anything like that, is that it is very slow to spread your presence. Like, you have the most trouble of anyone in the game of getting long targeting solutions, and none of your starting cards have long range either, unlike some of the other spirits that tend to be really localized but have long range options to affect things far away. You're a profoundly local spirit if you're just playing Keeper without assistance. You are you're in one place probably for a couple of turns. Even when you're not in one place, you're contiguous and you have trouble spreading very far away from there. In that sense, it's sort of like Ocean that starts inland. Though your targeting solutions are, in practical terms, even worse than Ocean, just because Ocean can pretty quickly target any coastal land, whereas it takes a long time to even get out of your corner with Keeper. This also means Keeper is going to be better on a couple of boards than others, because a couple of boards have a highest numbered jungle that has more neighboring territories than others. Just worth thinking about. Anyway, so that's the growth option. You do get an energy on top of it, which is nice. This is objectively a very good growth option, except for the fact that it makes it hard to bend your presence, and it's totally free in one of 2 growths for your turn, so that's great. Sort of what I'm talking about when I say the growth options are great. You can actually get a second growth in the turn. Now, the downside is that it costs 3 energy, but you get a power card on top of it, and you can have any land without blight within 3, which is an especially big deal since you can then place more presence there using this because you now have a new land. So one of the things you can do if you're not getting any outside help, and probably sort of need to, is you can try to prioritize keeping enough of your early energy that you can play this early. Although, unfortunately, even with your 2 starting energy per turn, just glancing down here, you can see your cards are expensive. So it can be very difficult to do this early, to get enough energy to do this early on and still be playing cards. And obviously, if you're playing on any reasonable difficulty, you can't just not be playing cards. That doesn't make any sense. So that's a bummer. But again, if you're just looking at, okay, what's good about this spirit, this is a very good option to have, especially when your energy growth track especially is so good. Being able to double grow without assistance while also gaining a power card and effectively only costing, like, if you combine these two, you're effectively at -2 energy, +1 power card, +2 presence. That is a ferociously good growth option. Grow energy presence, also completely reasonable. Like Beasts, Keeper is another spirit that will almost certainly grow every single turn, including the reclaim turns, right? Because you can pick these 2 together. So you're going to have, in terms of your great strengths, you have very powerful tracks, and while your targeting will be awkward, you will get steady and sometimes extensive growth over your 2 tracks throughout the entire game. All right, good. That means that if you want to min-max Keeper of the Forbidden Wilds, the very, very best thing you can do, and this is true of almost every spirit in Spirit Island, which is one reason I don't play Spread of Rampant Green very much anymore, to bury the lead a little bit. But especially with Keeper, the best thing you can do is just jam in Spread of Rampant Green and start proliferating it as soon as you can. Because getting Gift of Proliferation solves every single problem this spirit has. It gives you your extra grows to get to the point where you can afford to pay for your own double grows or whatever very quickly. It gets you out of your initial starting box because Gift of Proliferation just lets you place a presence within one, even though that's very difficult for you to do on your own. If you're looking for a hyper carry that you will proliferate 2 times in the first 3 turns with Spread of Rampant Green, and then it will kill all of the invaders starting on about turn 3 to 5, Keeper of Forbidden Wilds is in the running with Serpent Slumbers Beneath the Earth for your spirit. Like, I'm pretty confident that if you play reasonably well and draw reasonably well on the powers, there are not a lot of level 6 invaders in the game that you couldn't pretty easily dumpster by just sticking Keeper with Spread of Rampant Green, ramping up the Keeper, getting up to 2 card plays and a bunch of energy, going ham on major powers because it's pretty easy to gain a power every turn you don't reclaim, or maybe even the turns you do if you really get so much energy that you're just doing this all the time. And then just maybe even finish out the growth track if Spread of Rampant Green keeps ramping you. Once you finish out your growth tracks, you're still absurd because every single turn you reclaim all your cards, get a new one, and get an energy, right? Like, if you want to build your own hyper carry, congratulations, Keeper, you're in the running. I don't know whether Keeper's better or Serpent's better, but both of them are great. So let's assume you're not going to do that, because if you're going to do that, honestly, nothing below the line really matters. Keeper does whatever it wants over the first couple of turns, and then it just becomes a god. Fine. Okay. Let's assume instead you're trying to actually do what the spirit is theoretically supposed to do, which is advance in this slow wall and keep people out. So the innate powers are sort of defining for that. You've got Punish Those Who Trespass, which, other than destroying Dahan, is quite good. You know, once you start being able to trigger it, you just blow up houses in your lands. Given that it's hard for them to get into your lands to begin with, probably that's good enough. If it's not good enough, then in the mid-game, you get to start doing a bunch of damage, and then potentially even you start getting to split it. This is a justification for focusing on the card play track if you're playing a Keeper that isn't getting ramped. I don't really think you can afford to do it. I think you sort of have to get to this pretty early just because you've got to be able to, like, I don't think 2 energy or 3 energy per turn is really enough to play your cards, let alone ever do this, which you would love to do no matter what you're doing. So my guess is, even if you're playing a mostly minor power Keeper who wants to do this, you're probably looking at, like, unlock this, unlock these, then go up this track. But one way or another, this is a justification for sticking on this track. Once you get a lot of elements, this gets very strong. 5 will get you a lot of elements, especially once you get the Plant and the Sun off this track, which you can maybe do with this. I don't know. But one way or another, this is a good power. It's good at saying, okay, once you get inside my wall, I'm probably going to kill you. The Dahan destruction is less relevant because when you create a place of power, you can push all the Dahan out of the land, and you never have to move Dahan into your places of power with events, although you can do it with your powers if you want. So if you just want to keep all the Dahan out of your lands too, you can generally do that. You're going to create places of power all the time, you sort of have to because of the way this works. Sometimes you'll create 3 stacks and feel bad about it, though with Spreading Wilds, you can probably avoid that. But again, you're going to create a sort of a wall of place of powers if you're just playing it straight, so you can generally get the Dahan out and not have to kill them. Also, you're good enough at killing things in your own land that you don't really care about destroying the Dahan in game mechanic terms, just sort of, I always feel bad about destroying the Dahan in personal terms. But in terms of gameplay, it's not really much of a downside. Your other one is Spreading Wilds. Spreading Wilds has the Sharp Fangs Memorial problem where you can't target blighted lands, which means, once again, this is a spirit you probably don't want to play with spirits that just love to spew blight all over the board, although it's less of a problem just because you tend to be so localized. Like, if you play Keeper with Wildfires and you just let Wildfires set one board on fire and you plan to deal with the other one, that's pretty reasonable. So You push an explorer from target land per 2 sun you have, so pretty reasonably likely to be able to get 2 sun. 3 of your cards start with sun, and this space provides sun. Generally, you're going to want these to be the first 2 spaces you unlock, and this to be the third, with most builds of this spirit, I would expect. So you're talking about getting this as long as you play a card, starting on turn 2, and probably you can get it on turn 1 because you're probably not going to play Regrowth and Roots on turn 1. So you sort of count on just always being able to push an Explorer out from the land. This is nice because because in sort of normal play, this guarantees that you'll be able to add the wilds with this section of it, which adds wilds if the land has no explorers, even if they explore into that land when you aren't looking, right? Flip side, this is the reason that if you're playing Keeper straight, they're not very good against France. Because again, France explores 2 explorers into a land. So if you want to be able to add wilds to a land against France, you have to have 4 sun to push their 2 initial explorers, which is a much harder proposition. Obviously, side note, pushing all the explorers out of the land is also valuable on top of being able to add the wilds there because it prevents the build and so on, all the reasons that the explorers usually are good to leave. So basically, the double explorer from France is ruinous for this particular power, which is normally very good. This power sort of has a lot of the same benefit that the good river powers have, where you just cut off a whole chain of bad events by getting rid of that explorer. Then on top of that, if there are no explorers, you get to add a wilds there, which means on the next turn you can grow into it, which is really important. It doesn't really scale up other than if you can get up to 4 sun, which plausible, right? You get 1 off the track, you get 3 card plays, sure, fine. If you can get up to 4 sun, you get to push 2 explorers, which can be relevant against France, although against France you're probably already dead at that point. But can also be relevant just because, like, you push the explorers around enough, and eventually you don't have places you can push them into where you haven't already pushed one, and so on, and that gets problematic. Although, funnily enough, one of the better things to do with this is to push the explorer into a land that already has your presence so that you can later kill it by punishing those who trespass, right? So, like, it feels like, flavor-wise, it feels like what you want to do with his ability is be like, no, get out of my forbidden areas, right? But gameplay-wise, what you often want to do with his power is say, no, get into my forbidden areas so I can kill you. Worth remembering. Because I often have trouble remembering that because my brain thinks the flavor way, so I'm like, no, get out of my area. If you don't already have a good target for punish those who trespass, get into your area. Anyway, the only other scaling it has is that the range can go up. That's not bad, that's good, especially because this is your primary way of arranging to be able to spread your presence. But you don't have any air off your starting cards, so unless you get a lucky early minor, this isn't going to come up. And realistically, it wouldn't have to be an air sun, actually, because once you've unlocked this. Anyway, if you get an early, it can be worth looking for an early air power to get this up, especially if you want to be able to, if you're playing with someone who you need to help, and so you want to be able to get over to their board quicker. This can be important. This you'll eventually start getting at some point. It's fine. I mean, they're both good. They're both worth thinking about, but yeah. Basically, good power, very good early, really your best way early for controlling builds and such. Yep. This is sort of your meat and potatoes power. Starting ones, we have Sacrosanct Wilderness. You push 2 Dahan, you do 2 damage per wilds or add a wilds. Cannot target lands with Blight for reasons. I mean, I guess the idea is that the Forbidden Wilderness should be like pristine or whatever. Anyway, it's a pretty bad power, honestly. This power has the problem that... So, the good news is you can team this up with Spreading Wilds to effectively be able to immediately do 2 damage. This combo is a good way to deal with the early villages, which can otherwise be a problem for you in lands you want to spread into. You're like, okay, get an explorer out of that land, out of wilds, go to my next turn, play the Sacrosanct Wilderness and blow it up. Sacrosanct Wilderness is not the card you have that lacks a sun, so unfortunately, if you want to get turn 1 this into turn 2 Sacrosanct Wilderness, you have to play both of these on turn 1, which is difficult to do. Oh, yeah, right. I'd forgotten. But yeah, this is actually a big problem. So, initially the thought is, what I'd like to do is, on turn 2, I would like to Sacrosanct Wilderness to clear a village. So that means on turn 1, I need to get Spreading Wilds. The only way to do that is to grow onto the sun. And only play 1 card turn 1. Which is fine. You know, it's okay. But you can't actually get 4 energy turn 1, so you can't actually play both of these cards. So if you want to grow into the second card play on turn 1, you can't set up for that play. Unless, you know, you're getting energy from your friend or whatever. Not disastrous, especially because you don't always want a Towering Wrath on turn 1 anyway, but worth remembering. That means that you're more often going to grow like this, and then this, and then this, or even this, and then this, and be on 1 card play, rather than immediately go to the 2. For once, they managed to make a spirit where it's interesting whether you get 2 card plays immediately. Good job. This is really the one you want to be triggering every turn, and once you have this sun, you can trigger it for the first 2 every turn, playing anything except regrow. So, yeah. That's good. Obviously, things also get complicated because you're going to gain a power card most turns. Worth being aware of. If you draw a sun card on your first power card draw that costs less than 3, that goes out the window and you can just unlock the second card play. I guess... No, it doesn't have to be sun plant. Just sun. Yeah. Right. But there's no way to predict that, so I'm just talking about looking at what's on the board. It is worth remembering that you're going to gain a power card on turn 1 with this spirit effectively every time, though, so you can't plot out the turn 1 plays as strongly as you can with spirits that aren't realistically going to get a power card on turn 1. Anyway, Sacrosanct Wilderness, by far the best thing to do with it is to set up for it with this and immediately use it. If you try to do anything else with it, you are just cursing the invader deck to immediately ruin you by exploring into whatever land you're trying to set up for, which sucks. Like, I don't think 2 energy out of wilds is very good to begin with, but it certainly is frustrating to spend 2 energy out of wilds to a land planning to grow into it, and then they just explore into it and remove the wilds instead. It's hard to be too upset about preventing an explorer by just adding a wilds, I guess, in most cases, but, like, it still sucks. The nightmare situation is where you play this knowing you're reclaiming next turn to set up a wilds that you're planning to play it on next turn, and then they remove that with wilds with the explorer, and then you can't get rid of the village you were targeting, and they just explore into that land so the village is going to build, and it sucks. You know, it's fine. It's still a good card. Just be aware. You also get to push 2 Dahan out of the target land. You must push 2 Dahan out of the target land, I should say. This varies between nice, because you're now clearing out the land so you don't want the Dahan there to fight anymore anyway, and intensely frustrating, because what you're trying to do is... Because what you'd really like to do is kill enough of the stuff that the Dahan will win the fight, or you can defend the Dahan or something, but then you have to push out the Dahan that are going to win, so that sucks. You know, just be aware. It's a double-edged sword there, but it is required. You can't... It's not push up to do Dahan, it's just, nope, out they go. But yeah, this 2 damage per wilds mode is the most common mode of it. You'll most commonly use it to clean up a house. Usual caveats apply. That means that Keeper has even more early game trouble against people who have tougher houses, for example, than other spirits. But yep, totally reasonable early game 2 mana kill a house card. Little fiddlier than the gold standard set by Lightning, which is literally just 2 energy kill a house, but it's fine. Boon of Growing Power, classic do-nothing card. It has the elements you want for this, so that's good. giving your friend an energy and a power card is not in fact doing nothing. Like, it's better than an actual do nothing card. But it has the usual issues of a card that invests in energy in card play and doesn't do anything immediately to affect the board. That said, it's a nice friendly power. You have good long-term energy generation, so it can remain relevant later because it lets you transfer your energy to other spirits. You have good force. You have a good flow of power cards yourself anyway, so there's not a lot of appeal to targeting yourself, other than the fact that your starting cards sort of are not great. So that's the appeal. But by and large, I'd suggest targeting your friend with this, unless they're someone who has just no energy problems at all, in which case you might as well target yourself to try to more quickly get meaningful cards to play with your really good tracks. But yeah, this is a fine card to weave in. You'll frequently end up weaving it in once you get to 2 card plays because it has the elements you want for this. Totally reasonable. Regrow from Roots. This is a classic do-nothing card. It's incredibly narrow targeting, can only target a jungle or wetland, has to be range 1 of your presence, removes Blight, inexplicably only removes Blight if there are 2 or fewer. I'm not sure that's ever come up, and also this would not be a very good card even if it could just remove Blight anyway, so I don't know quite why. I guess it's a flavor thing where, like, if there are 3 or more Blight, there just aren't any Roots left. Sure, fine. But, so, I'll preface this by saying that, obviously, if you actually get to remove a Blight with this, that is significantly more than nothing, given that your targeting gets made awkward by Blight, and you really don't want to go into Blighted Island, even more so, I think, after this expansion than now, which we'll get to when we talk about the events. So, if this works, it's actually good. On the other hand, there are a lot of starting boards where there literally is no Blight starting on a jungle or wetland. There are probably even more starting boards where it isn't within range of your starting jungle or wetland. So, like, there are going to be a lot of games where in the first couple turns of the game, you cannot target this in such a way that it will do anything. On top of that, this is the only card in your starting deck that doesn't create Sun, which means it is really bad to play it until you have unlocked both your second card play and your Sun off the track, because if you do, you don't get to push the Explorer from the target land, which you really want to push the Explorer from the target land. So, I am not impressed with this card. I rarely play this card. It's usually the first card I replace. Arguably, it shouldn't be the first card I replace, because it is true that you can get screwed over by the Blight. Obviously, if you're playing with, say, Wildfires, this becomes a much more appealing card to keep because you know you're going to have targets for it. Though, even then, I'd really only be excited about it if I was building for card plays pretty aggressively, because once you're getting all this energy, if you're going on the energy track, you want to be playing big, heavy hitters every turn, not whatever this is. Anyway, yeah, not a fan. Towering Wrath. Towering Wrath is the big heavy hitter that you have in your deck. Like most big heavy hitters starting in your deck, it's not super impressive in terms of efficiency for energy or anything really, but, you pick a land, makes 2 fear, does at least 2 damage there, maybe does 4 damage there, probably never does more than 4 damage there, but still, starting card, 2 to 4 damage and 2 fear, destroys all the Dahan, but fine, whatever. Like, this is up there with, it's probably not as good as, Manifest in Power and Glory out of Thunderspeaker, but that's like the gold standard for 3 mana questionable cleanup cards out of the starting deck. It's pretty equivalent to Vital Strength of Earth's similar card, which is a card that you play probably once or twice a game and are happy about it. Also, this is the only card in the starting deck that has all 3 of the elements that you really care about for your innate powers, so you're effectively talking in the early game about, well, not the very early game because you can't afford to play it with other cards, but once you're into the mid to late early game, you're talking about getting bonus damage again off of this if anything's in your lands, because it's realistically going to be your best way to trigger this. So that's also nice. This is a good card. This is the best of the cards in this deck. To me, this deck has 2 good to great cards, indexed to starting cards. No starting cards are great compared to upgrade cards, but that's sort of the nature of the game. Indexed to starting cards, it has 2 good to great ones, Sacrosanct Wilderness and Towering Wrath, because both of them just, do a bunch of destruction of things near you, which is what you want. You especially want it because you're pretty good at preventing builds near you, which means what you want to do is clear up the any villages or things that are left over from setup near you sooner rather than later, so that the invaders stop trying to explore into your inland lands. You want to reduce their exploration range ASAP. These are cards that allow you to do that in relatively short order. Both very valuable for that reason. That's nice. Neither of these cards affect the board at all. That sucks. In general, I do not consider Keeper of the Forbidden Wilds to be a powerful early game spirit. It seems like it should be, because it has a way to deal with builds and a way to deal with things on the board, but this deals with 1 land per turn. The invaders invade into 2 lands per turn. Between cleaning up things that are already there and the fact that they're exploring into twice as many lands as you can clear the explorers out from, it still usually feels like you're losing ground in the early game with this spirit. You can keep up potentially with the if you get lucky on the initial explorers. If the initial explorer goes into a land where they already have a house, you can use this combo to clean up that starting house, but they will still get a build where the other explorer was. Maybe you can clean it up with Towering Wrath, although unless you're getting energy from someone else, you're not doing that on turn 2. You're not playing both of these cards on turn 2 after playing Boon on turn 1. I don't think. That's 6 energy. 1, 2, 3. No, you could. Okay. So that's fine. Obviously, again, this is all thrown into confusion by the fact that you're getting a power card every turn. So if you get good power cards off the top of your deck, you're golden. You get a couple of good things to deal with explorers or defenses that make ideally a sun, but maybe a plant or a fire and a fire or something. Suddenly you're really in good shape. If you're relying on just these cards because you're whiffing on your minor power draws off the gain a power card, you're really hoping that they explore into areas where they already are so that you can get stuff into there to clean them up. You're hoping that they end up positioned well compared to your difficult to grow powers, stuff like that. Otherwise, you can end up really falling behind. And like Sharp Fangs, there's nothing in Keeper that makes the Ravage your friend. In fact, it's even harder to make the Ravage your friend with Keeper because you move the Dahan around against your will so often. And they can't come back into your lands, into your places of power due to events. So it's not only difficult for you to defend the Dahan, it's difficult for you even to get them where you want them if the invaders manage to start getting into your lands. If you're playing at level 0, you can probably stop the invaders from getting into your lands pretty well, assuming you don't get really unlucky off of your power cards and your explorers. So probably the promise of I'm going to have a wall where they can't live and then I'm gradually going to expand it, probably that promise works pretty well at level 0. Once you get any higher than that, it gets harder because extra things that start on the board are really bad for you, and extra things that get added to the board are really bad from you because your early tempo is so knife edge to begin with. And we'll presumably show this off because I'm sure as heck not going to play at level 0. So you will probably get to see some of that difficulty whenever I get around to doing a test game, a game with this spirit. I don't think I'll do the game with the spirit where I play it with Spread of Rampant Green because I don't think that really is all that interesting. because you don't really get a feel for how the spirit plays on its own. If you play it specifically with Spread of Rampant Green, you just get to cheat it up into its best stage very quickly and get around its biggest downsides. Which, look, I say that with some amount of scorn in my voice just because I find one of the things that I think is sort of sad about Spirit Island, one of very few, I think this remains my favorite tabletop game of all time, and being someone who professionally deals with tabletop games, that is saying a lot. One of the very few things I find sort of unfortunate about Spirit Island is that adding Spread of Rampant Green to any team incredibly increases that team's power, but also incredibly homogenizes whatever spirits you're teaming up with, because there are so many spirits that are defined by the difficulties of their growth tracks, or the peculiarities of their growth tracks, the peculiarities of where they're allowed to place presence and why, how they grow, how their growth tracks interact with certain thresholds, and as soon as Spread of Rampant Green can target you even once, let alone twice, with Gift of Proliferation, none of that matters anymore. You break out of the natural gating that you have by your growth options. You get to place presence within one, even if your growth options make that hard. You get to place in Blighted Land, even if that's difficult for you. It's great. It's super effective. If you would like to face the hardest opposition in the game, I suspect you basically have to do that. I think if you're going to do level 6 really hard adversary plus the thematic board plus a scenario that increases difficulty, Spread of Rampant Green Abuse is probably your only hope. That said, one of the things I really like about Spirit Island is getting a feel for how the spirits are all really different, so I try to avoid doing that when possible. If you're going to avoid doing that to get a feel for the spirit, Keeper's big problem is getting over that hump. Because if you can get over the hump to where you can start playing a bunch of major powers and targeting them effectively, you're incredibly good. The difficulty is dealing with that, and it becomes increasingly difficult as you go up the difficulty more so than others, because your difficulty is so keenly based on what already starts on the board and how quickly things get added to it. So, that's my conclusion with Keeper of the Forbidden Wilds. If you would like Keeper to trash everything, play it with Spread of Rampant Green and Rampant. Otherwise, think very hard about bringing a spirit that can address things on its board better. Ocean, for example, might be a pretty good choice, because Ocean can start intervening in the coastal lands of Keeper's board pretty early, and Keeper starts far away from everything else. Or alternately, just any of the spirits that have a pretty good long-range presence place or can move around pretty easily. So, Thunder Speaker. Fangs is actually a pretty reasonable team-up in some sense, just because they both hate Blight and so are incentivized to prevent it from getting on the board. And Fangs is quite good at getting into areas that are far away from its start. Unfortunately, I think Fangs is too weak to really carry Keeper's early game on higher levels, because it has enough trouble keeping its own board clear, let alone also keeping Keeper's clear. But maybe it'd work okay. Maybe I'll give it a try. It's sort of a bummer that I couldn't do it against France. I had so much trouble trying to team those two up against France that I've sort of been put off it, but on the other hand, France is terrible for both of them because of the double explorers. Speaking of which, let's move on and talk about France. So, Kingdom of France, Plantation Colony. Base difficulty is 1. Base difficulty includes the additional loss condition, which is you cannot let there be too many villages on the board. 7 per player. If you ever can't place a village, because there are already 7 per player on the board, the invaders immediately win. This is a problem for spirits that have rough early games sometimes, though it's generally hard to lose to it in the really early game. It's a bigger problem for spirits that don't really want to kill things and just want to push them around to prevent them from doing stuff. In particular, this is a problem for River Surges and Sunlight. This is a problem for maybe the Nightmare Spirit. That's full title I'm forgetting right now, but since it tends to push things around early. But I would say River Surges in Sunlight is the biggest victim of this particular additional loss condition. It's such a good spirit that you might be okay anyway, but you should be aware that if your early game is based on pushing villages and villages especially around to prevent ravages rather than winning the ravages or destroying the villages, you could lose to sprawling plantations quite credibly. Especially at the higher levels, where more villages get added to the board and more get added quickly, this can get out of hand in a real hurry if you're trying to do delay triage rather than actually get the villages off the board. The Stage 2 escalation, demand for new cash crops. After exploring on each board, pick a land of the shown terrain. If it has villages or cities, add a blight, otherwise add a village. This is just a typical nasty escalation. One thing to be aware of is how it interacts with sprawling plantations. You can very easily get locked into cases where you have to put blight down because otherwise you will lose to this. You also want to think harder about whether you want to put blight or villages down than you would otherwise, because you don't want to end up in a situation where you put down so many villages avoiding blight that you are in very serious danger of losing to this. I'm sort of surprised that they say base difficulty is 1 on France. I think that combination of abilities is actually quite dangerous and affecting compared to, like, I hate Sweden's Dahan subverting thing, but I don't think it's as dangerous as these two are. This is a dangerous combo. Not that I ever play at base difficulties. I didn't actually realize that was the thing you could do when the game first came out, because the difficulties weren't all listed on the card like that, so I just sort of assumed you started at 1. Anyway, these are both important and both worth remembering, and their interaction together is important. Level 1 difficulty adds, except during setup, after invaders successfully explore into a land which has no villages or cities, add an explorer there. This is the double explore I was talking about. Technically, it's not always a double explore. This means that if you are brave enough to bring Keeper against France at level 1 or higher, you are even more interested in France exploring on turn 1 into somewhere that already has a village or city, because that allows you to actually get rid of the explorer with your thing. But in general, this is another ability that is very important to remember when you're selecting spirits, because spirits that rely on killing individual explorers in order to prevent the early game from getting out of control cannot do that against France. Keeper and Fangs spring to mind as the most impacted by this, which, again, awkward, because ideally what you do for the expansion show-off is just bring both of the new spirits against the new invader, but the new invader has their number. But there are a lot of spirits that are sort of tangentially affected, and maybe some that I'm misremembering. Thunder Speaker is also sort of affected, because it means that sudden ambush into a land where there's an explorer and no Dahan won't kill all the explorers, but sudden ambush kills an explorer per Dahan, so you can still usually prevent a build with it. And Thunder Speaker is so good at winning ravages and getting villages off the board that I still think Thunder Speaker is a high pure pick against France. But it's worth remembering there too. There may be some others I'm forgetting about as well that are particularly laser focused against single explorers. On the flip side, this means that spirits that can deal with multiple explorers out of the basic deck become better. Examples include, interestingly, River Surges in Sunlight, which is injured by this ability, is better against this ability because River has various things that allow you to get rid of multiple explorers at once, including the thing that does 2 damage in a coastal land. And just in general, a lot of the big push card on River pushes 3 things. So on the one hand, you have to be aware that you're building up a problem for yourself later. On the other hand, pushing both explorers in the village they build is still good enough to prevent a ravage. So River actually gets a little bit better off of this ability. I think River's a fine thing to bring against France. You just have to be careful. Really, this mostly hoses the 2 new spirits and maybe some I'm forgetting about. Awkward. So then slave labor turns on at level 2. During the setup, you put the Slave Rebellion event under the top 3 cards of the event deck. After invaders build in a land with 2 or more... So this is really 2 abilities together. The slave labor means the slaves help you. Yay! You get to free the slaves while also freeing your island. A win-win. So this is an event card. I think it's pretty self-explanatory what it does. You get an event every turn. So this will happen on the 3rd turn of the game. This is only in the deck if you're playing against France. You can't get this as a normal event otherwise. So, during stages 1 and 2 of exploration, which is the first time it comes up only, I think. Well, no, it depends on what level. I can't remember. Either the first time or the first and second time it comes up, this will happen. You get to add an unrest to a village, because the slaves are rising there. And then after finishing this whole event card, you draw another one, and then put this card back in as the 3rd card again. So this will happen on turn 3 and then turn 6. Either this will happen or this will happen. I think it's Small Uprising again on turn 6. Then eventually it turns into the Full Rebellion. On the Full Rebellion, you just trash a village, add an unrest to any 2 villages or cities, and then every invader takes 1 damage per unrest it has. Then you get another event after finishing the whole card, and it's discarded. On top of whichever one of these 2 happens, there is also always Aid the Uprising, which is the Dahan help out the slaves. That means invaders with unrest take 1 damage per Dahan, and any slaves that win their uprising, therefore destroying the village, join the Dahan, which is awesome. I love the flavor on this card. I love the fact that you can help the slaves overthrow their masters and join the Dahan people. This is just a feel-good event. A+ flavor, good thing. Obviously, in terms of France's perspective, this card is a downside. Nothing that this card does is good for the invaders, and it immediately replaces itself with another event, so it doesn't even blank an event, although events are usually good for the invaders anyway. But, this is just... This half of the ability is pure downside. You love slave rebellions, you want them to happen all the time, you'd especially like to get Dahan into places where the slave rebellion happens. Awesome. You know when this is coming up, you can remember when it's coming up. Weird that I can't close the card. Anyway, you know when it's coming up, and you can and should plan around it by getting Dahan into places where you want to aid uprisings. You can really turn a big problem area around by using Slave Rebellion to just trash half the invaders there and gain a couple of extra Dahan. That's really powerful. This is another thing that makes River better despite this condition than it looks, because what you can do with River is you can create a place with several you can create sort of a colony with several villages, and then you can use the whatever the right is that makes more Dahan. I call it the Dahan dating service, but that's obviously not what it's called. Anyway, you're good at moving both Dahan and villages, which means you can set up a place where it's just ripe for a slave rebellion, and the invaders get owned, and then the next time they ravage there, you can win off all of the slaves that have joined your Dahan, and it's great. This is another one that makes Thunderspeaker obviously much better, because Thunderspeaker is so good at moving the Dahan around. So you, every time you have some spare Dahan, you just pump them into somewhere where they can potentially aid a slave rebellion, and then once the slave revolt comes up, you've got a couple of isolated villages that come over to your side. It's great, it's good flavor, and it's powerful. Again, once you're at level 2 or higher, you want to be able to... you benefit from being able to move Dahan quite a bit because you can set up for this event. Now, the downside is, after invaders build in a land with 2 or more explorers, you replace all but 1 explorer there with an equal number of villages. This is a doozy of an ability. It definitely involves an increase in... It definitely deserves the increase in difficulty, even though the Slave Rebellion card is good for you, because this means that the standard explore and to build pattern for France is just terrifying, right? The standard, they explore into an empty land, they place 2 explorers. They build there, they place a village and turn an explorer into a village. Suddenly you've gone from a land with 0 in it to a land that attacks at 5, and you've got 2 villages on the board for your sprawling plantations condition, is bad news. There's not really anything you can do about this other than realize that it means that spirits that can clear out those 2 explorers are at even more of a premium because the problem that they're preventing has gotten worse, right? So anyone who can clear out those explorers before they build gets better. It doesn't make River any less at addressing the build there, but it still gets worse just because since there are 2 villages, you have to worry more about the sprawling loss condition. But basically, this means if you can get rid of 2 explorers, you're better off. I should also note that Ocean is another one that is very good against the double explorers because Ocean has that card that pulls 2 explorers into the ocean, where it's often hard to get both explorers with it. With France, it just clears out an empty coastal space that they explored into, which is very good. The other thing about this is going back to the slave labor, the other thing that that this does is that because it adjusts the unmessed with ravage from 3 attack to 5 attack, it means that defend 2 and defend 3 become less powerful. Spread of Rampant Green suffers from that some, although Spread of Rampant Green's so good you mostly don't care. Thunder Speaker actually suffers from that some because Words of Warning at defend 3 no longer defends if you just let them explore and build into somewhere, although Thunder Speaker's good enough at clearing up villages and towns that that's not a deal breaker. But anyone else who has 2 to 3 point defends, Earth has a 3-point defend, I'm pretty sure. Is Earth 3 or 4? I guess I should look. Oh, Earth is 4. Okay, so Earth's fine. But there are... when you're looking at your spirits, just say, well, Earth has the defend 3 for the double stack. That's what I was thinking about. And the double stack isn't enough anymore. When you're looking at your starting spirits, and you see defend 2 or defend 3 as something that's going to be useful, you have to recontextualize it based on this ability. This also means that you can't... getting rid of 1 village is no longer enough to address a ravage, because there are going to be 2 villages. Though that's true even starting there, because you leave the 2 explorers. So that means that cards that attempt to address a ravage by destroying a single village are less good. Mostly, I think that affects Thunder, where the fact that it kills all the explorers with its 3 cost 1 damage to everything is good enough that I think it's probably still fine. But unfortunately, it's further bad for Keeper of Forbidden Wilds, and it's further bad for the Beast, because both of them have 2-point powers that address a ravage in the absence of something like this, but this spoils that. Okay. Level 3, they just get more villages, but it's a lot more villages. It's 2 more villages per board. So once you're at level 3, you have to start worrying about this much earlier, in addition to the fact that there are just more places that are going to be bigger problems faster. There's not really anything to be done about this. It just makes them harder. I guess that's not technically true. It sort of restores some of the value to being able to kill individual buildings, because with some spread out individual buildings early, you get more benefit from clearing them out sort of passively. It doesn't let you win ravages with it, but at least you'll have something to do. I don't know. I don't consider this one to be hugely shaping. Triangle trade. Whenever invaders build a coastal city, add 1 village to the adjacent land with the fewest villages. This one is another thing that makes Ocean pretty good against France, because if you can keep them off of building coastal cities, obviously that is very good. Other than that, it really just means that you can't... It really just influences it during play. Sometimes against France, you're in a weird spot where you care less about where you have to... Not a weird spot, but you're in a spot where you want to prioritize stopping builds that are going to build villages over builds that are going to build cities, because even though the city's more dangerous than the Ravage, you don't want to lose to this. That messes with that rubric, because if they're going to build a coastal city, they're effectively also building a village. So it just means that you might want to prioritize stopping coastal builds that'll build a city. Slow healing ecosystem. When you remove Blight from the board, put it here instead of onto the Blight card. As soon as you have 3 per player here, move it back to the Blight card. I don't consider this to be a hugely impactful ability, and neither really does the game, since this is only a 1 point difficulty jump as opposed to 2 for early plantations or slave labor. It's really notable that slave labor is a 2 point jump despite having this bad event that goes in the deck. It does deserve it. This is a nasty ability. So anyway, slow healing ecosystem. When you remove Blight from the board, put it here instead of on the Blight card. Once you have 3, move it all back. In effective terms, in most games, what this is going to mean is that you are more likely to go into Blighted Island, and it is somewhat less valuable to have Blight cleanup cards. There aren't really a lot of spirits that rely on cleaning up Blight. There aren't really a lot of spirits that rely on cleaning up Blight and also do that primarily to avoid going into Blighted Island, as opposed to, like, Keeper, who really wants to clean up Blight, but that's because Keeper has trouble operating in Blighted lands, so that makes sense. This doesn't really hurt Keeper any more than it was already hurt by the terrible double explore thing, because you still get to clean up the Blight. It's still not on the board. You can still operate in that land. You're just a little more likely to get blighted. The one spirit I would say this does hurt a lot is Wildfire. This hurts Wildfire both because Wildfire is often cleaning up Blight. It has a pretty easy to trigger innate power that cleans up some Blight, and Wildfire makes going to Blighted Island almost inevitable, but also wants to delay it as long as possible. And on top of that, Wildfire is one of the few spirits that is, like, at reasonable risk of losing to the island, losing to the Blight card, even in a game you could otherwise win, because it spits out so much Blight. This is a really problematic problem for ability for Wildfire specifically, and I would suggest being really careful about playing Wildfire against France 5+. Other than that, I don't think it matters all that much. I mean, you'll lose to it sometimes and it'll be embarrassing, but you don't really plan around it. And then Persistent Explorers. After resolving the Explorer card on each board, add 1 Explorer to a land without any. Fear card effects never remove Explorers. Instead, they push Explorers. Yep, sucks. This is basically just an ability that means you have yet more Explorers to deal with, and so insofar as it should impact your spirit choices, what it means is you want to be even more prone to picking spirits that are good at dealing with Explorers, and especially good at dealing with a lot of Explorers at once, because you're likely to get there are a lot of fear cards that remove Explorers, which means you're likely to instead push them around, which means you can arrange to have a whole bunch of Explorers in one spot. If you have someone who can kill all of those, like Lightning, like potentially Thunderspeaker with a late game sudden ambushes after they've got a bunch of fast moving Dahan or whatever, if you can set that, or anyone else that does 1 damage to everything in a specific spot, if you can set that sort of thing up, then you can mitigate some of the effects of this. But this is another classic sort of level 6 that just makes France do more of what they're doing better. Also worth remembering that it interacts with the second half of slave labor really poorly for you. You don't want to pile everyone into somewhere where they then immediately flip a build card before you can deal with them and suddenly get 10,000 villages and you just lose. Not good. In general, for France, your priorities are dealing with Explorers and dealing with villages. You worry much less about the cities because there's nothing special about them. You really want to be able to clean up explorers quickly and efficiently. You really want to be able to actually remove villages from the board, not just move them around. Those are the priorities. In terms of spirits I think are especially effective under those situations, Lightning Swift Strike is especially effective under those conditions, both because it can clear out every explorer in a space with one of its starting cards, which is awesome, but also because it has both passives and cards that just sort of coincidentally pick up villages, which means that you can, without having to rely on a Ravage, which means you can both maybe even cut off some inland explorers, but especially you can just sort of passively pick up random villages as you're doing other things, which means you're much less likely to lose to sprawling plantations. So I would say Lightning Swift Strike is a big winner. I would say Thunderspeaker is a big winner because Thunderspeaker is so good at moving the Dahan around to interact with the Slave Rebellion event, and also because Thunderspeaker has lots of good ways to clean up explorers and villages without having to interact through Ravages. If you're using Thunderspeaker, you have to be a little bit careful because your ability to interact through Ravages is reduced by the fact that Words of Warning isn't enough anymore if you just let them explore and build somewhere. On the other hand, if you do any amount of explorer control or building control, Words of Warning is enough, so I don't consider that determinative. Ocean gets a little bit better because it's better at stopping the triangle trade ability if you're on 4+, and because it can eat 2 explorers at once off of coastal lands. I don't think it gains as much as Lightning or Thunderspeaker does, but it's definitely good. Oh, Lightning is my top pick against France, I think, unless I'm forgetting someone, because the other big deal with Lightning is that being able to make your friend's powers fast and your weird powers fast means that the number of damage powers that can suddenly deal with the double explorer before they become a problem goes radically up. Or with, like, a place where they just built, right? Like, there's so many powers that are, like, do 2 damage at slow, or out of the minor power deck, or out of the major power deck, do 4 to 6 damage at slow. Usually 4. Both of those get a lot stronger if you can fast them against France, obviously. I mean, always, but doubly so against France because those thresholds are, like, those slow powers that do 2 damage are, you can't use them after a build against France the way you can against other people. But if you can make them fast, you can use them to preempt the build, and so, like, they just... Lightning making those better means that your scope of options for cards that are good against the specific stuff goes up a whole lot. I could look and see if there are any that I'm forgetting that I think do super well against France. I guess we might as well just leaf through to remind myself anyway. I think River is not as good as any of the other 3, but a totally reasonable pick just because it's such a good spirit. Of course, there's Spread of Rampant Green, who I never really mentioned. Spread of Rampant Green is just good. Like, it's good against everything. It's fine. You might think that Spread of Rampant Green is not so good against France because the All-Enveloping Green Defend 2 is useless. On the other hand, it's not all that hard to get to the Defend 4, and it's great. And also, Stem the Flow of Fresh Water is incredible against France because if you've got a bunch of villages in mountains or sands and do 1 damage to each one, then you get to finish a bunch of them off with this, potentially, and you can actually clear up a bunch of villages all at once. Also, it's just the best. And on top of that, you can address Ravages with Choke the Land with green, which is very good against anyone who wants to Ravage. So, yeah, Spread is fine. It's fine. It's always good. River, I would say, is probably about on par with Ocean. In terms of being good. The ones that really suffer, Earth suffers a lot because it has not enough defense to deal with an Explore and Build anymore off of its passive. Serpent actually sort of suffers because Elemental Aegis is such a great card. You can't really, like... it's going to be real hard to get 2 presence onto the Deep Slumber track early enough to make this get up to 4 to be good. So one of your best cards becomes one of your worst cards. Obviously, if you're running Serpent with Spread because that's a broken combo, you're probably still fine. I would avoid Serpent if you're trying to play it straight, because Elemental Aegis is like your mainstay defense, and it just doesn't work very well against France. And then, of course, the 2 Expansion Spirits lose out because both of them are not good at dealing with the double explorability. Okay, so this is already probably a pretty long video because I went on at quite some length, but I want to talk briefly about the other special editions. We touched on the events when we talked about there are other cards. When we talked about the Slave Rebellion card, or Slave Revolt, or whatever it's called. The way events work is you get 1 every turn. They happen after you have locked in your powers for your turn, but before the invaders do anything. I always forget whether they happen before or after fear cards. I think they happen before fear cards, so if they make fear, you might get a fear card. That sounds right. In any case, they happen right around the same time fear cards happen. So after you've locked in all of your powers for the turn, but before the invaders do anything. They're mostly just there to add extra, to make it so that you can't math out all of your turns, and I like that. I think they make the game better. They certainly do that. They will throw a wrench in the works with some regularity. They're pretty easy to read, and you can generally just figure them out. They have various conditions, so only part of them happens sometimes, right? This one does this part at Fear 1 or 2, this one at Fear 3, so on. A lot of them cause beasts to do something or other. Yeah, they're just things that can happen. There are also some, like this, where you get to make a choice, but one of the choices costs you something. So these are the only ones that aren't totally clear from reading them, because they have this aided by thing. The way aided by works is that for every symbol of that you have in play, so on your played cards or your tracks, it contributes 1 energy. You can discard a card like that from your hand to contribute 2 energy, and you can forget a card to contribute 4 energy. I think that's how it works. I'm now double thinking myself because it's been so long since I played. But luckily on the online client, the game handles that. You can discard them to contribute and forget them to contribute. I'm pretty sure it's 2 and 4 for discard and forget. Or you can just pay energy out of your pool. So with this one, the invaders are compelled by the island and curious, so you can either ignore their curiosity, in which case they basically become... This returns the top card in the invader deck, so they start exploring more aggressively, more quickly, and you lose to running out the explore deck faster, and also they build extra villages. This is obviously bad, right? Like, if you ignore their curiosity, that sucks. You can also weave lies in the minds of their observers, which is pretty funny. And that costs 4 energy per player, but less if there's a bunch of air going on, or if you discard or forget air cards. That returns the top fear card to the box, so that's obviously good for you. It accelerates the fear win and getting to higher fear stages. But during the next normal ravage, each village and town does +1 damage, which obviously you're already locked in on having played your fast powers and stuff, so this can completely screw you over in terms of losing some ravages you thought you were winning if they were right on the edge, or if there were a bunch of things there. Some of them are like this, where even if you pay the energy, there's a downside. Some of them aren't. It's sort of inconsistent, but it's not the kind of thing that I find it's worth planning around during play, except on the broadest levels. The things worth remembering are there are various events that will cause the invaders to do a little bit more damage, which means that if you're relying especially on defend 2s, or exact defends, but defend 2 is going to be the most common of those in most cases, it gets a little awkward, because there is a chance that defend 2 just isn't going to work, right? Or defend where 1 point of extra damage will screw you over won't work. There are a few that add more than 1 damage, like each X does +1 damage, or like some that have cities do +2 damage, But generally, if you're exactly equal, you have to get pretty unlucky to lose unless there are a lot of things there, so that if it's each does +1, you right? Like if there are a lot of the same kind of piece there, you have to be a little bit worried. But usually if you're equal defending, you're going to be broadly okay, and if you're defending by +1, you have to get really unlucky for it to mess you up. So what it mostly is a reason to over-defend if you've got pretty similar plays, but one of them makes defend 4 where you need 3, and one of them makes defend 3 where you need 3. You might as well do the 4 because maybe the event will mess with you. The other thing in terms of general play worth remembering about them is that they incentivize you for having extra energy lying around. If you have to ignore the invader's curiosity or have to forget important air cards, that can be really rough. And there are other ones like this where like you really don't want to have to, you really don't want to not pay. Like this can send you right into Blighted Island by removing Blight from the Blight card. What are some of the other ones? I'm trying to remember which ones are in this particular one. Missionaries Arrive. This one is one. If it sucks not to pay for the sun for this because it turns. So this one you aren't quite sure what it's going to do. Sometimes you flip some sun symbols and the Dahan just tell the missionaries no anyway, which is nice. But like if they don't, it replaces Dahan with villages, which sucks, and then goes back into the event deck, which sucks in general because it means you'll have to deal with it again. But double sucks against France because it delays the slave rebellion coming up, which you really don't want. So what cards like this mostly do is incentivize you for not running incredibly hot on energy. Obviously, there are a lot of spirits that can't avoid it, and so you just sort of have to deal. But if you're faced with decisions where you're like, do I take the 0 cost power or the 1 cost power that's maybe a little bit better, it gives you more reason to tend towards the 0 cost because having a bit of energy in the bank so you can pay for those is generally quite important. I believe this client also does the rule where this is a rule that was added for the second tabletop expansion, but I think it was retroactively added to all versions, where on the first turn the event doesn't actually happen. You discard the cards. The Slave Rebellion still happens on time if it's involved, but you don't actually resolve the event on turn 1. So I think you don't have to worry about an event on turn 1, but starting on turn 2 you do. Anyway, that's the events. The other thing are the tokens. I realize now that I talked about the Unrest token for the France event without actually explaining what it does. Sorry about that. Sorry if it confused you or if you already wrote a comment being confused. Anyway, as I said, there are 4 different kinds of tokens added in the event, in the expansion. We already talked about Wilds. Wilds prevents an explorer, then goes away. We already talked about Beasts. Beasts don't do anything except that a bunch of events make them do something. You can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 13 out of 24 or so of the events have this little symbol that means the beasts do something. That means there's a roughly 50-50 shot the beasts do something every turn. What the beasts do is of deeply varying value, and of course if you're not adding or moving beasts, they might not do anything in the land, but the beasts mostly interact with events. The 2 we haven't talked about are Unrest and Sickness. Unrest, basically, you put an Unrest token under a invader piece, and that invader piece is basically on strike for the next Ravage. So the next time a Ravage occurs, that invader piece will not contribute any power. It won't fight Dahan, it won't damage the land. Dahan will still kill it back if the Dahan will still kill it. Like it's still... The invaders still ravage there. Even if all of them have Unrest, the Dahan will still fight back. But it basically just prevents one time that invader would fight in a Ravage. And, of course, it also interacts with the France Slave Rebellion cards, so cards that add Unrest are better against France because you can set it up so that the slaves are unhappy and will revolt and maybe help you. None of these start on the board, but various powers and events and things add them. And this new Fear card, too. Finally, we have Sickness. This is Sickness. Sickness works like the Wilds token only works for builds. So if the invaders are going to build in a land with sickness, they don't build, but the sickness goes away. Interestingly enough, sickness does start on the board. With the expansion, the land 2 on every board, which is the one that starts with a city. Come on, there we go. Starts with a sickness, and they've actually now printed that on the maps. So land 2 starts with a sickness. The beast starts on the lowest numbered land that has no other setup icons. Yeah, it must be because it's 1 here. So you can see on this board, in addition to the starting city on land 2, there's a sickness, and then in land 1, there's a beast. Those are the 2 things that the expansion adds. Side note, this or C or D are the boards I would suggest for Wilds if you're going to play them, because they don't have this terrible corner jungle that only borders. This is the worst. Don't play Wilds on B. Anyway, so those are the 4 token types. Mostly, you don't have to worry about them too much. They're all good for you. Just add them when you can and be aware of what they do. Finally, the very last thing we got in the expansion is we got some new fear cards. That's not really worth bothering about. I don't think, I can't imagine you gain any appreciable win percentage from memorizing the available fear cards or events. That doesn't seem like... It seems like any individual one coming up is so low chance that it's not worth it. But one of the big deals is we got a whole bunch of new Blighted Island cards, which is awesome, because if you'll recall, in the first game, both Blighted Islands did very similar things and were both really annoying. There was the first one where every invader phase, the spirit forgets a power or destroys a presence, and then there was one where at the start of each invader's phase, each spirit just destroys one of their presence. When you knew Blighted Island was going to be one of these 2 cards, it became incredibly difficult to go into Blighted Island for any of the spirits that have trouble getting a lot of presence on the board, which I thought was tiresome and annoying. So I'm really glad that now there are 6 additional Blighted Island cards, which means you no longer really know what's going to... Right, and both of these cards are also very similar, which meant you effectively, in the base game, you knew effectively exactly what was going to happen when you went into Blighted Island. Maybe you'd get a little bit more less blight to play with in exchange for not having to destroy one of your presence. Maybe you'd have more blight to play with in exchange for always destroying your presence. But one way or another, your presence was going to be under threat, and you'd get a lot of blight. Now, we have things like this. This is one of my favorites. This one, the lesser spirits come to your aid because they finally realize that the environment is getting too bad. If only humans would do that. Anyway, minor spirits come to your aid, and so you actually get a big boon, which is to say you get a relatively small choice of minor power cards, and each spirit gets 1, and you just get to play it free for every turn, which is so cool. It changes how the game plays. You've got basically a new innate power, except it adds elements instead of costing them. Very fun. And then the downside is you have very little blight to play with. I love that you can have cards like this come up now, because it means that Blighted Island is always worrying, but you no longer have to be like, uh-oh, better not take this spirit that is under real presence pressure, potentially, because if we go into Blighted Island, it's going to be a real problem. And conversely, you don't get to be like, yeah, whatever, Wildfire's going to get us into Blighted Island, but once we get into Blighted Island, we're going to have infinite blight to play with. I mean, not infinite, but 8 to 10 blight in a 2-player game is a lot of blight. And so we don't have to worry too much about actually losing to blight with Wildfire. It's just we have to worry about dealing with the Blighted Island effect. If you flip 2 blight per player off of your card with Wildfire, it gets really awkward, because there's a reasonable chance that one of them's going off anyway because of a cascade or something, and then you're like, wait, I can only put 3 more blight on the board total before we lose? This minor spirit is great, but this is awkward. So it just means that you have a lot more... The blight cards are much more spirit agnostic in terms of the overall pool, which means it's much more exciting to flip it up, and it has much bigger effect on the game. There are few enough of these that they're worth looking at, so we'll just quickly go through them, just note them. So this one is sort of middle of the road. It's bad for you and the invaders, but only has 3 blight. This is just like everyone gets sad because the island isn't as nice anymore. This is another one where the spirits get a bunch of extra power, but there's less blight, but there's very little blight pool. I enjoy both of these. I love a game where you're like, these are so cool because they feel like you're watching you're a sports team and you're down at the half and you go into the, like a sports movie. This probably doesn't happen in real life. I don't know. I don't play many sports, but like, they're down at the half. They go into the locker room. The coach gives them the best pep talk of their lives. They come out, their backs against the wall. They're playing really hard. That's what this feels like. I love that feeling. I love when you're like, uh-oh, we're in trouble. We just got into Blighted Island. And then you're like, okay, we're in much more trouble than we thought because due to the blight. But wow, now we're so powerful. Let's see if we can come back. I love that feel. This one gives you a huge blight pool to play with, but effectively less because it's effectively 4 per player because you're going to get a free blight on every board. But it's nice because there's no ongoing bookkeeping. It's just bad stuff happens and then you play. Same with this one. This one is pretty rough because it's only 3 blight per player and the only benefit you get is fear. This is probably one of the more dangerous ones. But again, it's nice because there's nothing ongoing to worry about. I hate with Memory Phase to Dust and Downward Spiral, I hate the feeling of having to do bookkeeping every turn in tabletop. And even online, it sucks that, like, you have to remember every turn that it's going to happen and it can mess with your targeting solutions and stuff. I much prefer the ones like this that just do a thing. And I think it's no surprise that most of the I think all of the added ones do that rather than some ongoing thing that's bad for you and easy to forget. Same with this one, you get 4, but you get a bunch of extra buildings, and then Tipping Point, everyone immediately loses 3 presence. This is another one that's really dangerous just because it's very difficult for this not to mess with your targeting solutions, and you're most likely going to go into Blighted Island during the Ravage, which means you can end up with slow powers that get really hard to target off of this one, which can be rough. But yeah, anyway, worth noting that there are new Blighted Island cards, and it's a big improvement to the game. Overall, I'm super glad this expansion came to the PC. I hope that they add Shattered Earth at some point, although I understand that it's got like 10 spirits in there or something like that, and some of them are absolutely wild. There's one of them that has, I think, maybe as many as 10 different growth tracks that are all really short, and you like pick which growth track to grow off of every turn. It's wild. There are a bunch like that do really interesting things, plus a couple of extra token types and things like that. So it'd be a big project, and I understand that, but I'd love to see it because obviously it like doubles the number of spirits in the game, and so much of what's fun about Spirit Island is all the different spirits that you can play with and how cool and different they are. And there's definitely some really cool and different ones in Shattered Earth. That said, even though I'm pretty down on the 2 actual spirits that were added with this game in terms of how good they are. Obviously, I like that they're interesting and fun to play, and they're neat spirits, and that's great. But I'm a little bit down on them just in terms of like their power level, which is too bad. But as far as I'm concerned, adding the event system is huge. The events make the game way, way, way better. I love the events. And adding the extra Blighted Island cards is incredibly welcome. Those 2 things alone, great, totally worth it. The fact that we get 2 extra spirits on top of that you can like play when you want to tilt at windmills and try to figure out how to play them, awesome. Nothing wrong with that. Totally worth it, totally good. Managed to talk about it for 2 hours. Hopefully people enjoy that. I will hopefully get a game done. I might just go right into a game after this. Talking about Spirit Island for a couple of hours makes me happy, so maybe I'll just play. Should have lunch first. Otherwise, I'll try to get it done soon. No promises. The world of 2022 is a wretched place. But, I hope to. I'd like to show off at least one of the new spirits, or at least France. We'll see about showing off the new spirits, given how I feel about them. But I at least want to show off France, because it's dangerous and fun and interesting. And show off the event system and stuff. So, hopefully soon. All right, thanks for watching.